Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Easy English Spark. I'm excited to have you here today. Get ready to dive into how I improved my English and built my confidence through 10 key chapters. We'll start by exploring the challenges of being a beginner, then dive into building vocabulary, improving pronunciation, and learning grammar naturally. I'll also share my journey of getting a job in an English-speaking city, testing my progress, and how mistakes became a vital part of my growth. This is your chance to unlock tips and strategies to help you practice, grow, and improve your English. Let's dive in and light up your English journey. Chapter 1. Introduction to Selina. Hello, everyone. My name is Selina. I'm a student of English, and today I want to share with you my journey of learning this beautiful language and how it has transformed my life. It all started when I decided to move to London, a city that I've always dreamed of living in. But before I go into that, let me take you back to the very beginning, when I first began my adventure with English. Growing up, I always had a passion for literature. I loved reading stories, novels, and poems, but there was one thing I always struggled with: understanding them in English. I could read the words, but the meaning behind them wasn't always clear. That's when I realized that in order to truly enjoy the world of literature, I needed to learn English. So, I started my journey as a beginner. It wasn't easy. At first, the words seemed strange, and the grammar rules felt like a puzzle I couldn't solve. I spent countless hours memorizing vocabulary, watching English movies with subtitles, and practicing speaking with a dictionary in hand. But despite my hard work, there was always this feeling that something was missing. One of the turning points in my journey happened on a bright, sunny day in the summer. I was traveling on a train in London, heading towards the city center for an English course I had signed up for. It was my first time visiting the city, and I was nervous, but also excited. As the train rolled along the tracks, I found myself sitting across from two women. They were speaking English, and although I couldn't understand everything they were saying, I knew they were having a friendly conversation. I couldn't help but listen, trying to pick up words and phrases that I recognized. As the train moved on, I realized I had an opportunity to practice what I had been learning. So, I decided to take a deep breath and speak to them. I said a few words in basic English, introducing myself and mentioning that I was learning the language. To my surprise, they understood me perfectly. It wasn't a perfect conversation, and I stumbled over a few words, but it didn't matter. The women were kind and encouraging, and they helped me feel more confident in my ability to communicate. They told me that they were from England and were returning home after attending a conference. They asked me where I was from, and I told them I was a student studying English. I was so excited that I could hold a conversation, even if it was just a short one. After about 10 minutes, the train reached my stop. As I was about to leave, they handed me a piece of paper with their contact details. "If you're ever in England, don't hesitate to visit us," they said with a smile. That moment, that simple exchange, gave me the motivation I needed to continue my English learning journey with more passion and dedication than ever before. When I got back to my room, I thought about the conversation I had. It was so simple, yet it made a huge impact on me. I realized that I didn't need to know everything, but I had to be brave enough to try, to speak, and to make mistakes along the way. From that day forward, I promised myself that I would practice English every day. I would read more books, watch more movies in English, and speak as much as I could, even if I wasn't perfect. And so, my learning continued. It wasn't long after that I made the decision to take my learning to the next level. I had heard about an English language school in London, and I decided to enroll. I wanted to be immersed in the language, to have the opportunity to learn from experienced teachers, and to interact with other students from all around the world. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but I was determined to make the most of this opportunity. Little did I know that joining this school would be the start of a new chapter in my journey, one that would change the way I approached learning forever. But that's a story for another chapter. For now, I just want to say that learning English has been a challenge, yes, but it has also been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. I've made mistakes, I've struggled, and I've felt discouraged at times, but I've also learned so much, met amazing people, and experienced things I never thought possible. This is just the beginning of my story, and I hope you'll continue to follow along as I share the next chapters of my journey with you. Thank you for listening. Chapter 2: The Start of Her English Journey. When I think back to the beginning of my English learning journey, it's hard to believe how far I've come. It feels like a lifetime ago when I first decided to learn English seriously. I remember the frustration of not being able to express myself clearly, the confusion of hearing others speak a language I didn't fully understand, and the constant battle to keep up with my lessons. But what really stands out in my mind is the moment when I decided to take my learning to the next level, a decision that, in many ways, shaped the rest of my journey. It all started in a small, quiet room in my hometown. I had a passion for literature, as I mentioned earlier, and I loved reading books, poems, and stories. But my understanding of English was limited to what I could pick up from my textbooks and online resources. I was good at memorizing vocabulary lists, and I could translate some sentences, but that wasn't enough. I wanted to be able to read novels in their original language, to understand the characters' emotions, and to be able to have real conversations with people in English. I wanted to feel confident speaking the language, not just reading it from a page. But even though I studied hard, there was always this feeling that something was missing. No matter how many hours I spent reading or watching movies in English, I felt like I was still stumbling. The words just didn't come to me naturally. I knew the grammar rules, but when it came to speaking, I would freeze. This feeling of being stuck was frustrating, and there were times when I questioned whether I was ever going to get better. But I also knew that giving up wasn't an option. I had to keep pushing forward. That's when the encounter with the two women on the train happened. I had been living in London for a few weeks, and although I was getting more comfortable with the city, I still felt like an outsider. I was trying to learn English, but there were so many moments when I felt like I didn't belong. I would hear conversations around me, and I could pick out a word here and there, but overall I couldn't fully understand what people were saying. It was like everyone around me was speaking in a secret code that I didn't know. One day I found myself on a train traveling through the heart of London. The sun was shining, and the city seemed to be alive with energy. I sat down in my seat, staring out the window, trying to block out the noise around me and focus on the book I was reading, but my attention kept drifting. Two women sat down across from me, speaking to each other in English. I didn't recognize every word, but I could tell they were having a friendly conversation. Their voices were clear and confident, and I couldn't help but listen in. Even though I couldn't catch all the words, I was fascinated by how effortlessly they spoke. They weren't hesitating or searching for words. They were just talking, as if speaking English was the most natural thing in the world. I sat there for a few minutes, feeling a mix of awe and frustration. I wanted to be able to speak like that. I wanted to be able to engage in a conversation without thinking twice about every word. But I was still a beginner, and it felt like I was a long way from where they were. And then, something inside me clicked. I realized that if I wanted to improve, I had to start somewhere. And that somewhere was right in front of me. So, I took a deep breath and decided to speak to the women. At first, I was nervous, my heart racing as I tried to gather my thoughts. But I reminded myself that the only way to improve was to try, even if it meant making mistakes. I gathered up the courage to speak, and I said, "Excuse me, I'm learning English. I want to get better. Can I talk to you for a moment?" To my surprise, the women smiled warmly and responded in clear, slow English. They could tell I was a beginner, but they didn't judge me. Instead, they encouraged me to keep going. They even helped me with a few words I didn't know, and we had a short but meaningful conversation. It wasn't long, just about 10 minutes. But for me, it felt like a breakthrough. For the first time, I felt like I was part of the conversation, not just an observer. They were kind, and they made me feel like it was okay to make mistakes. that learning English wasn't about perfection, but about connection. Before I left the train, they handed me a piece of paper with their contact details saying, "If you're ever in England, feel free to visit us." I was stunned. I had just met these women on the train, and yet they were so open and generous with their time. That simple act of kindness had such a profound impact on me. It reminded me that language is not just about grammar rules or vocabulary lists. It's about connecting with others, sharing experiences, and learning through those connections. From that moment on, I knew I had to keep going. I had to work harder to learn English, not just for the sake of passing exams or memorizing vocabulary, but for the sake of being able to communicate, to share my thoughts and feelings with others, and to build connections. The encounter with those two women gave me the push I needed to take my learning seriously and to seek out more opportunities to practice. I remember going back to my apartment that day and feeling a renewed sense of purpose. I promised myself that I would practice every day, even if it was just for a few minutes. I would read books in English, watch movies, listen to podcasts, and try speaking with anyone who would listen. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, and there would be times when I'd want to give up. But I also knew that every small step I took would bring me closer to my goal. Looking back, that conversation on the train was the turning point. It was the moment I realized that learning a language is not a solitary task. It's about engaging with the world around you, using the language to communicate, and embracing the mistakes along the way. That's when I truly began my journey, and it's a journey that continues to shape who I am today. Chapter 3: Working Hard to Improve. After that memorable conversation with the two women on the train, I knew I couldn't go back to just studying passively. It was a wake-up call for me. I needed to immerse myself in English, not just as a subject to be learned, but as a tool for communication. I had spent so much time studying textbooks, memorizing lists of words and grammar rules, but I hadn't put them into practice enough. The real turning point came when I promised myself that I would work hard every single day to improve. I began to think about what I could do to really make progress. The first thing I did was set small, achievable goals for myself. It wasn't about becoming fluent overnight or learning every word in the dictionary. It was about making consistent progress, one step at a time. So I decided to incorporate English into my daily routine as much as possible. I would start by dedicating at least an hour every day to learning and practicing the language. This wasn't easy, especially with everything else I had going on, but I knew that this effort would pay off in the long run. One of the things I found most helpful was making English a part of my environment. At home, I switched everything to English. My phone settings, the apps I used, even the websites I visited. It felt strange at first, but over time, it became second nature. I was constantly exposed to English, even in ways I hadn't considered before. The more I was surrounded by the language, the more I started to absorb it without even trying. But it wasn't just about changing the settings on my phone or reading a few articles in English every day. I knew that to really improve, I needed to actively engage with the language in different ways. So, I started listening to podcasts in English. I found a few that were specifically designed for learners, but I also started listening to podcasts on topics I was passionate about, like literature, culture, and travel. Even though I didn't understand everything at first, I pushed through. I would listen to an episode once, then listen again, and this time, I would focus on picking up new words or phrases. The more I listened, the more I started to recognize familiar words and phrases, and it helped build my confidence. Next, I began watching English movies and TV shows, but I didn't rely on subtitles like I had before. Instead, I tried to challenge myself by watching without them. If I didn't understand something, I would pause the video and look up the words or phrases I didn't know. At first, it felt frustrating. I'd miss parts of the story, and sometimes I'd have to pause the video every few seconds. But slowly, I started to understand more and more. It was like the pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together. I also started to watch movies with English subtitles, not just in my native language, to help me associate the words I was hearing with their written form. Reading was another important part of my learning routine. I knew that reading books in English would not only improve my vocabulary, but also help me understand sentence structure and grammar in context. At first, I began with simpler books, like young adult novels or short stories, because they were easier to understand. Gradually, I moved on to more complex texts. I would take notes while reading, jotting down new words or expressions, and then look them up to make sure I understood them correctly. It was like every book I read opened up a whole new world of vocabulary and grammar rules I hadn't fully appreciated before. But I didn't stop there. Speaking English was the area where I knew I needed the most improvement. I had this fear of speaking because I was afraid of making mistakes. After all, who wants to sound silly when they're trying to learn something new? But I realized that if I wanted to get better, I had to overcome that fear. I had to start speaking, even if I made mistakes. I began practicing speaking every day, whether it was in front of a mirror or recording myself speaking. I would choose a topic and try to speak about it for a few minutes, focusing on fluency rather than perfection. Sure, I made mistakes, but that was the point. I wasn't trying to be perfect. I was trying to learn. To push myself even further, I found language exchange partners online. I connected with people who were learning my native language, and we would practice speaking English together. It was an amazing experience because we both understood what it felt like to be a beginner. We would take turns speaking in English and in my language, correcting each other's mistakes and helping each other grow. It felt like we were both on this journey together, and it made me realize how important it is to practice speaking with others, especially when you're learning a new language. The best part of all this hard work was when I started seeing progress. At first, the improvements were small and barely noticeable, but over time, I began to feel more confident. I could understand more when people spoke to me. I could have longer conversations without feeling like I had to search for every word. It was like the words were coming to me more naturally, and I could express myself more easily. Even my teachers at the language school started noticing the change. I remember the first time my teacher complimented me on my pronunciation. It felt like such a huge accomplishment because I had been working so hard on it. The constant practice, the listening, the reading, and speaking were all paying off. It wasn't just about memorizing vocabulary or rules. It was about making the language a part of who I was. It was about using English in my everyday life. Not just in the classroom or in exercises, but in real situations where it mattered. But I wasn't done yet. I knew that learning English was a lifelong process, and I was just getting started. Every day, I pushed myself to improve, to get better, to learn more. I wanted to be fluent. But I also wanted to understand the culture, the humor, and the nuances that come with speaking a language. I wanted to feel like I truly belonged in the world of English speakers. In this chapter of my journey, I realized that working hard isn't always about pushing yourself to the limit. Sometimes it's about consistency. About doing something every day, even if it's just for a little bit. It's about not being afraid to make mistakes and knowing that every mistake is a step towards becoming better. It's about embracing the process, no matter how slow or frustrating it might seem at times. And most importantly, it's about not giving up. So I kept working hard. Every day, every moment, every opportunity to learn was a chance for me to improve. And as I kept going, I knew that the more I practiced, the better I would get. And eventually, that hard work would pay off in ways I couldn't yet imagine. Chapter 4. A New Chapter in London. As the weeks went by, I realized that my journey to learn English was about more than just memorizing vocabulary or practicing grammar rules. It was about stepping outside my comfort zone and immersing myself in the language. That's when I made one of the most important decisions of my life. I decided to move to London, the very heart of the English-speaking world. I had always dreamed of living in this vibrant city, but I never imagined that my desire to improve my English would bring me here. The decision wasn't easy, though. I had to leave behind my family, my friends, and the familiar life I had known. London was intimidating, bustling, and foreign. I was excited, yes, but also nervous. How would I adjust to living in such a fast-paced English-speaking environment? Would I be able to keep up with the language? Would I find a community where I could belong? But I knew deep down that this was the next step I needed to take if I wanted to reach the next level in my learning. I couldn't keep studying from afar, relying solely on textbooks or online lessons. I had to experience English in its natural habitat. I had to be surrounded by it every day, in every conversation, in every corner of the city. London, with its diverse population, its rich history, and its thriving cultural scene, seemed like the perfect place to do that. When I first arrived, I felt a mixture of excitement and fear. The moment I stepped off the train at King's Cross Station, I was overwhelmed by the sights, sounds, and smells of the city. The noise of the traffic, the chatter of people, the buzz of energy. It was all so much to take in. For the first time, I felt completely immersed in an English-speaking environment, and I knew that this was where I had to be to push myself further. The first few days in London were a blur. I found a small flat in a quiet neighborhood, settled in, and started familiarizing myself with the city. But, as you can imagine, I was still struggling with the language. Even though I had studied for months, hearing English spoken around me, in different accents with different slang, was a whole new challenge. It was one thing to learn the basics in a classroom or through textbooks, but it was another thing entirely to navigate the streets of London, order coffee, ask for directions, or simply strike up a conversation with a local. It felt like I was constantly playing catch-up. That's when I decided to take the plunge and sign up for an English language school. I knew that this was the best way to immerse myself in the language, meet other students who were on the same journey, and learn from professional teachers who could help me break through the barriers I was facing. It wasn't an easy decision, though. I had always been independent in my learning, so the idea of going back to a classroom felt a little daunting. But I realized that this was exactly what I needed. I couldn't continue to rely on my self-study alone. I needed structure, feedback, and the opportunity to practice with others. I enrolled in a full-time English course at a well-known language school in central London. The school was diverse, with students from all over the world. It was amazing to see so many people from different countries, all united by the same goal: to learn English. I was excited, but also anxious. Would I be able to keep up? Would I feel out of place among students who might be more advanced than me? There were so many questions running through my mind as I walked through the doors on my first day. But when I entered the classroom, I was greeted with a warm welcome from the teacher and my fellow students. The teacher, a woman named Ms. Taylor, was young and passionate about teaching English. She made us all feel comfortable and encouraged us to speak, even if we made mistakes. It was clear that she cared deeply about our progress and wanted us to succeed. Her teaching style was different from what I had expected. Instead of focusing solely on textbooks and grammar drills, she focused on real-world communication. She made us talk to each other, practice conversations, and participate in discussions. All in English. The goal was to use the language as much as possible, and that meant stepping outside our comfort zones. Ms. Taylor explained that the best way to learn a language is not to memorize rules, but to use it in real life. She didn't want us to just read from textbooks or write long essays. She wanted us to think and speak in English naturally. I remember her saying, "If you're only studying grammar, you're missing the point. Language is about communication. It's about expressing your thoughts and connecting with others. So, don't worry if you make mistakes. Just keep speaking." First, I was terrified. The thought of speaking English in front of the class, in front of people I didn't know, felt overwhelming. What if I said something wrong? What if they didn't understand me? But Ms. Taylor's encouragement helped ease my fear. She reminded us that language learning is a journey, and making mistakes was part of that process. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about communicating. Gradually, I became more comfortable speaking in class. My classmates, all of whom were from different parts of the world, were supportive and patient. We would have conversations in pairs, discuss topics, as a group, and even role-play real-life situations. For the first time, I felt like I was truly practicing English in a way that mattered. One of the most surprising things I learned was how quickly I started to pick up new vocabulary just from speaking and listening. It wasn't the same as memorizing flashcards. It was about learning words in context, understanding how they were used in conversations. Every class, every discussion felt like a new opportunity to learn something. I began to recognize words and phrases I had only heard before and use them in my own speech. It was like a light bulb went off. The more I used the language, the more fluent I became. The classes were demanding, but they were also incredibly rewarding. Every day I felt myself improving. I could understand more when people spoke to me on the street, in shops, and at the cafe. I was no longer just a passive learner. I was actively participating in the language. It felt like I was living in English, not just learning it. Outside of class, I continued to push myself. I started making friends with fellow students and locals. I would practice speaking with them after class, go to events, and even volunteer at local organizations. It wasn't always easy, and I still made mistakes, but each mistake was an opportunity to learn, and I was determined to take advantage of every chance to speak. London became my classroom, and English became my way of life. I knew that this experience was shaping me into a better speaker, a better communicator, and a better person. It was more than just learning a language. It was about embracing a new culture, a new way of thinking, and a new way of living. London wasn't just a city anymore. It had become the backdrop of my English journey. This new chapter in London was exactly what I needed. It wasn't always easy, and there were days when I felt frustrated or overwhelmed. But I knew that every challenge, every setback, and every victory was helping me grow. And the best part was, I wasn't alone. I had the support of my teachers, my classmates, and the city itself. Together, we were all learning, growing, and moving forward. This was just the beginning of my adventure, and I was excited to see where it would take me next. But for now, I had found the perfect place to continue my journey, a place where English was no longer just a subject, but a part of my life. Chapter 5: Building Vocabulary. By the time I had settled into my new life in London, I had already begun to see significant improvements in my understanding of English. But there was still one area where I felt I had to focus more: vocabulary. I had learned many words during my studies, but I knew that in order to truly communicate effectively, I needed to expand my vocabulary and understand how to use these words naturally. It was one of the most essential aspects of becoming fluent, and it was something I was determined to master. I had heard over and over that the key to improving vocabulary isn't about memorizing long lists of words, but rather about learning words in context. It's one thing to memorize a word and its definition, but it's entirely different to understand how that word fits into a sentence, how it connects with other words, and how it's used in everyday conversation. So, I knew that my next step would be to learn not just words, but how to use them fluently and confidently. I started by incorporating English into my life as much as possible, trying to expose myself to the language in different contexts. I began to pay attention to the way native speakers used certain words and phrases in conversations, whether I was out shopping, at the cafe, or even just talking to people on the street. I realized that the more I listened and paid attention to how words were used in real life, the more I started to remember them. It was as if they were becoming part of my daily vocabulary, rather than just isolated words I learned in class. Reading was the first method I used to expand my vocabulary. I knew that reading was one of the most effective ways to learn new words. At first, I was reading simple books, young adult novels, short stories, and even newspapers. These were perfect because the language was accessible, and they provided me with real-world vocabulary that was used in everyday situations. Every time I came across a word I didn't understand, I made a habit of looking it up. But rather than just writing the word down and forgetting it, I took it a step further. I wrote the word in a sentence that I created, one that was meaningful to me. This technique helped me internalize the word in a context that felt relevant to my life. For example, if I came across the word cozy, instead of just writing its definition down, I wrote something like, I love spending Sunday afternoons in my cozy apartment, reading a book. By doing this, I wasn't just learning the word, I was learning how to use it in a natural way. It didn't stop there. I also started reading things that were a bit more challenging. I moved on to novels in English that were written by well-known authors, books that used more complex vocabulary. While this was a bit more difficult at first, I was determined to challenge myself. I would keep a dictionary by my side, but rather than looking up every single word, I would try to guess the meaning based on the context of the sentence. If I couldn't figure it out, I'd look it up. This method helped me build my intuition for the language and helped me develop a deeper understanding of how words fit together. Listening was another powerful tool in building my vocabulary. I knew that vocabulary wasn't just about what I read, it was also about what I heard. I began listening to podcasts, radio shows, and TED Talks in English on a variety of topics. Sometimes I listened to interviews with people who were experts in their fields, and other times I listened to casual conversations. I even listened to English music, paying attention to the lyrics and the words used in the songs. This was another great way to expand my vocabulary and understand different accents and pronunciation. I particularly enjoyed podcasts because they often focused on real-world conversations. This helped me learn phrases that I could use in my daily interactions. For instance, when I listened to interviews with people in creative industries, I picked up words related to art, design, and innovation. When I listened to stories or discussions about history, I learned new historical terms and how to discuss complex ideas in English. I kept a notebook where I wrote down interesting words and phrases I came across, and over time, I started noticing that I could understand more and more without needing to look things up as much. One thing I learned quickly was that practicing words was just as important as learning them. I had to actively use the new words I was learning. It wasn't enough to simply know them. I had to incorporate them into my speech and writing. So, I began speaking to anyone who would listen, even if it was just for a few minutes every day. I also started writing in English. At first, I wrote short diary entries, but soon I began writing longer pieces, like essays or stories, using the new words I had learned. At school, I made it a point to use new vocabulary in every conversation I had. If we were talking about a topic in class, I would try to use the new words I had encountered in my reading or listening. It wasn't always easy, and I made mistakes, but I knew that the more I used the words, the more natural they would become. I also asked my classmates and teachers for feedback on how I could improve my vocabulary usage, and they were always more than happy to help. The social aspect of learning vocabulary was incredibly helpful as well. I made friends with people who were also learning English, and we would often speak together, sharing our experiences and correcting each other's mistakes. Having these conversations outside of class helped me become more comfortable with the words I was learning. We would go to cafes, explore the city, and just talk. And those informal moments were just as valuable as formal lessons. They were real conversations where I could use the words I was learning in a relaxed environment. I also started watching TV shows and movies with English subtitles, which helped me reinforce my vocabulary. At first, I was watching familiar shows that I had already seen in my own language, so I could follow the story without much difficulty. The English subtitles allowed me to match the spoken words with their written form. As I became more comfortable, I started watching shows and movies I hadn't seen before, really focusing on the dialogue and picking out new words and phrases. The more I watched, the more I started to notice that my vocabulary was expanding. Not just with everyday words, but with more nuanced and complex terms that I could use in different situations. To make my vocabulary practice even more effective, I created flashcards for myself. I would write a word on one side of a card and its definition or an example sentence on the other. Every day, I would go through the flashcards, testing myself to see if I could recall the meanings of the words. This method was especially useful for learning synonyms and antonyms, words that had similar meanings or the opposite meaning. It was important for me to understand the nuances of words so that I could use them appropriately in different contexts. By the end of a few months, I noticed a huge improvement in my vocabulary. I was no longer just memorizing words. I was using them naturally, with confidence, and understanding how they fit into the bigger picture of English. My speaking, writing, and comprehension had all improved as a result of this focused vocabulary building. Practice. But even with all the progress I had made, I knew that vocabulary building would never stop. It would always be an ongoing process, one that would continue as I encountered new experiences and new words in the world around me. Building vocabulary wasn't just about memorizing words. It was about making those words a part of my everyday life. It was about connecting with the language on a deeper level, using the words to express my thoughts, and continuing to grow every day. And as I continued to build my vocabulary, I felt more and more capable of communicating effectively in English. The journey was far from over, but with each new word I learned, I felt like I was getting one step closer to achieving fluency. Chapter 6. Shadowing for Better Pronunciation. By now, I had made significant progress in my English learning journey. My vocabulary was expanding, and my confidence in reading and writing was steadily improving. But there was one area that still challenged me. One aspect that I knew I needed to work on to truly feel fluent: my pronunciation. It's one thing to learn a language, but it's another thing entirely to speak it naturally, with the right rhythm, intonation, and accent. As I spent more time in London, I realized that pronunciation wasn't just about saying words correctly. It was about being understood and sounding as natural as possible. I could memorize vocabulary and understand grammar rules, but if I didn't pronounce words clearly, it would still be hard for others to understand me, and I would miss out on many opportunities to truly communicate. I remember feeling frustrated because I could understand most conversations, but when it came to speaking, I sometimes felt like I was stumbling over my words. I would pause awkwardly, trying to figure out the right way to say something. And even when I did manage to say something, I often felt unsure about my pronunciation. Was I saying it right? Was I using the right tone or stress? I wanted to sound more like a native speaker, to have a more natural flow to my speech. But how could I improve? That's when I discovered the shadowing technique. It was like a light bulb went off in my head when I first heard about it. The shadowing technique, which is often used by language learners to improve pronunciation, involves listening to a native speaker and then immediately repeating what they say, mimicking the sound, rhythm, and intonation. It's called shadowing because you're essentially shadowing or copying the speaker's every word, just as their voice follows yours. This method seemed simple enough, but I wasn't sure how effective it would be. I decided to give it a try. I started by choosing a few podcasts and TED Talks in English. I wanted to choose something that was both interesting and clear, so I could really focus on the pronunciation rather than getting lost in the content. At first, I would listen to a few minutes of the speaker and then repeat what they said, trying to match their voice as closely as possible. It wasn't easy. I found myself struggling to keep up with the speaker's speed and natural rhythm. I had to slow down, repeat phrases multiple times, and really pay attention to every detail. The pitch, the stress on certain words, the pauses, and the way the speaker's voice rose and fell. It was exhausting, but I knew it was worth it. One of the challenges I faced early on was the speed at which native speakers talk. They don't always pronounce words as slowly and clearly as you might expect in a textbook or in language learning videos. Native speakers tend to link words together. They have contractions, and they often speak in a more casual, flowing manner. This was all part of the challenge. When I was shadowing, I realized how important it was to listen not only for individual words but also for intonation, rhythm, and linking between sounds. At first, it was overwhelming. I had to stop and replay sentences many times, trying to make sure I was getting everything right. Sometimes I couldn't catch every word, but I kept at it, determined to improve. It wasn't about getting every word perfect. It was about getting the sound right, the flow of the speech, and the intonation that made it sound natural. Slowly, things started to click. The more I shadowed, the more I noticed improvements. My mouth was becoming more familiar with the English sounds, and I started to feel more comfortable saying words I had previously struggled with. The technique helped me not only with the pronunciation of individual words, but also with how to speak English more fluidly, like a native speaker. But shadowing wasn't just about repeating words over and over. I quickly realized that listening was just as important as repeating. So, I began focusing on the context in which words were used. When I shadowed, I would listen carefully to the way the speaker pronounced certain words and noticed patterns in how words were stressed. In English, stress plays a huge role in making speech sound natural. For instance, in a sentence like, "I have to go," the word have is typically unstressed. But in the sentence, "I have to go," the word have is stressed for emphasis. Another interesting part of shadowing was intonation. Native speakers tend to have a natural rise and fall in their speech, which gives the language its rhythm and flow. I focused on mimicking not just the words, but also the rise and fall of the speaker's voice. This made my speech sound more natural and less robotic. At first, I found this challenging. It felt like I was trying to perform a song, mimicking the rise and fall of the speaker's voice exactly. But the more I did it, the more I realized that this technique helped me not just with pronunciation, but with understanding how English sounds, its natural rhythm and flow. As I got more comfortable with shadowing, I began to see real-world results. When I interacted with native speakers in London, I found that I was able to pronounce words more clearly, and my speech had a more natural rhythm. I also noticed that my listening comprehension improved. Since I had been listening to native speakers so much, I could understand conversations better, especially when people spoke quickly or used informal expressions. One of the greatest things about shadowing was that it helped me gain confidence. I no longer worried as much about making mistakes when I spoke, because I had practiced so much with native speakers. My mouth was becoming more accustomed to forming the English sounds, and I could say sentences with more confidence. It wasn't just about pronouncing individual words. It was about feeling comfortable with the language, about being able to express myself fluidly and naturally. I also started practicing shadowing with different accents and styles of speech. London, being such a diverse city, exposed me to many different English accents, from the classic British accent to regional dialects and international English accents. By shadowing speakers with different accents, I could adapt my pronunciation to sound clearer in different situations. I began listening to speakers with Australian, American, and even Indian accents, all of which helped me become a more flexible speaker. One thing I learned from this process was that consistency is key. Shadowing is a technique that requires regular practice. At first, I practiced for 10 to 15 minutes each day, focusing on one short segment at a time. As I improved, I increased my practice time, spending longer periods shadowing and listening to different materials. The more consistent I was with my practice, the more natural and confident I became in my speaking. Over time, I became addicted to this technique because it allowed me to hear and speak English in a way that was both practical and enjoyable. I wasn't just repeating words mechanically. I was actively engaging with the language, understanding its nuances, and molding my pronunciation to sound as natural as possible. By the end of several months of shadowing, my pronunciation had improved dramatically. I no longer felt self-conscious when speaking with others in English. I felt confident, natural, and capable of expressing myself without hesitation. But the journey didn't end there. I knew that pronunciation is an ongoing process. Even native speakers continue to adjust and refine their speech throughout their lives. Shadowing, in the end, became more than just a pronunciation exercise. It was a gateway to speaking English more fluently and confidently. It helped me get past my fear of speaking, allowed me to connect more deeply with the language, and gave me the tools I needed to sound like a native speaker, or at least as close as possible. Chapter 7. Getting a Job in London. By the time I had settled into my routine in London, my English had improved significantly, but I knew I still had a long way to go. I had become more comfortable with reading, writing, and even speaking in class. But there was one area that I was still unsure about: using English in real-life situations. I could understand most conversations, but I wasn't entirely confident in my ability to navigate the complexities of the real world, especially when it came to speaking with people I didn't know, or worse, speaking in professional settings. Had been thinking about getting a job for a while. London is a city full of opportunities, and I knew that having a job would give me the chance to practice English in a more authentic environment. It would also provide me with the opportunity to build new skills, make new friends, and immerse myself even more in the language. But at the same time, I was nervous. I wasn't sure if my English was good enough to work in a professional environment, and I worried about making mistakes or not being understood. But deep down, I knew that this was the next step in my journey, and I had to take it. One afternoon, after class, I decided to take action. I went home, opened my laptop, and started browsing job listings. I knew that I wasn't ready for something too complicated or specialized, so I began by looking for part-time or entry-level positions where I could use my English, but still get the support I needed. The first thing that caught my eye was a job posting at a local cafe. The cafe was situated in a trendy area of London, and it was known for its cozy atmosphere and friendly service. I knew that working in a cafe would give me the chance to practice speaking English with customers, and it seemed like the perfect environment for me to improve. I quickly prepared my CV and cover letter, highlighting my English language skills, my willingness to learn, and my enthusiasm for working in a customer service role. The next day, I sent in my application, and within a few hours, I received a response asking me to come in for an interview. I was excited, but also nervous. An interview would be my first real test of how well I could communicate in English, and I wanted to make a good impression. I knew that this was my chance to show that my English had improved and that I was capable of handling real-world situations. The interview day arrived, and I put on my best outfit, took a deep breath, and headed to the cafe. When I walked in, the first thing that struck me was how busy and bustling it was. The cafe was filled with customers chatting, reading, and enjoying their drinks, and the staff moved quickly, taking orders and serving food. It felt like a completely different world from the classroom, and I had to adjust to the fast pace of everything. I was greeted by Sophie, the manager, who was a friendly woman in her early 30s. She introduced herself and immediately put me at ease. We sat down, and she began asking me about my experience, my interest in the job, and why I wanted to work there. I answered in English as best as I could, and to my surprise, I felt relatively comfortable. My nerves had calmed, and I was able to communicate clearly, even when I didn't know exactly what to say. Sophie was kind and patient, and when I made mistakes or hesitated, she didn't seem bothered. Instead, she smiled and encouraged me to keep speaking. We talked about my background and my goals. I told Sophie that I was studying English and wanted to get better at speaking with people in real situations. I explained that I was looking for a job where I could practice my English every day and improve my communication skills. Sophie seemed impressed with my determination and enthusiasm, and after a short conversation, she offered me the job on the spot. I couldn't believe it. My first job in London, and it was exactly what I had hoped for. A chance to practice English in a real-world environment with the support of friendly colleagues and customers. The next day, I received an email confirming my job offer, and I was scheduled to begin my training the following week. I was excited, but also nervous. The idea of working in an English-speaking environment full-time felt daunting. Would I be able to keep up with the customers? Would I understand their orders and requests? I spent the next few days mentally preparing myself, reviewing common phrases I might need, and practicing in my head how to respond to customers. I was determined to make this opportunity work. Training at the cafe began, and Sophie showed me the ropes. The first few days were a blur. I had to learn how to take orders, serve food, and interact with customers in English. I was constantly learning new vocabulary related to food, drinks, and customer service. The most challenging part was trying to understand the different accents of the customers. Some spoke clearly and slowly, while others spoke quickly, and some even used local slang that I wasn't familiar with. But I didn't let it discourage me. I took notes when I didn't understand something, and I asked my colleagues for help when I needed it. Over time, I began to feel more confident. I learned the names of different items on the menu, the phrases customers often used, and how to ask follow-up questions to ensure I understood their orders. One of the most helpful aspects of working at the cafe was that I had the opportunity to practice English every day. Every time I interacted with a customer, I was using new words and phrases, and I quickly realized that the more I practiced, the easier it became. The customers were patient and understanding, and many of them even complimented me on my English, which gave me a huge confidence boost. I was surprised at how much I could communicate in a short amount of time. I could take orders, engage in small talk, and resolve any issues that came up, all in English. As I got more comfortable with the job, I started taking on more responsibilities. I learned how to handle payments, clean tables, and even manage. Some of the back-end tasks like restocking supplies and setting up for the next day. Each new task required me to use English in different ways, and I relished the challenge. I knew that by doing this job, I was not only improving my English, but I was also gaining valuable experience in customer service, which would help me in the future. Working at the cafe also gave me the chance to meet a variety of people from different backgrounds and countries. Many of the regular customers were locals, but there were also tourists, students, and professionals who came in for a coffee or a meal. I had the opportunity to practice speaking with people from all over the world, which expanded my cultural understanding and helped me refine my communication skills. Sometimes we would talk about London, about our lives, or about our favorite things to do in the city. These casual conversations allowed me to practice English in a more relaxed, informal setting, and I found that the more I talked, the more natural it became. In addition to improving my English, working at the cafe gave me a sense of belonging. I was no longer just a tourist or a student in London. I was part of the city's vibrant community. I was contributing to something, and I was using my language skills in a meaningful way. It felt good to know that I was improving, not just for myself, but for the customers I served and the colleagues I worked with. They respected me, and I respected them. I felt like I was growing, both personally and professionally. After a few months, I felt like a different person. My English was no longer something I thought about constantly. It was something I used automatically in all aspects of my life. The job had given me the confidence I needed to speak without hesitation, to understand others more easily, and to continue improving every day. But more than that, it had taught me the importance of practice and persistence. Every day I worked, I became more fluent, more confident, and more connected to the world around me. Getting this job in London was a pivotal moment in my journey. It was a challenge, yes, but it was also the best way to apply everything I had learned in a real-world context. It allowed me to step outside my comfort zone and face my fears of speaking English. And most importantly, it showed me that the path to fluency isn't just about studying in a classroom. It's about getting out there, engaging with people, and learning by doing. Chapter 8. Learning Grammar the Natural Way. At this point in my journey, I had made great strides in my English learning. I was feeling more confident with my vocabulary and pronunciation, and I had learned to navigate daily situations in English with greater ease. But there was still one area that I knew I needed to focus on: grammar. It's a challenge that every language learner faces, understanding the rules that govern sentence structure, verb tenses, articles, prepositions, and all the little nuances that make a language come to life. And yet, despite my growing proficiency in speaking and listening, I still felt that grammar was a weak point for me. I've always heard people say that grammar is the foundation of any language, but as much as I understood its importance, I also found that traditional grammar lessons often felt dry and mechanical. Memorizing rules and drilling exercises didn't seem to help me when I tried to use English in real conversations. It was like I had all the theory in my head, but I couldn't apply it in practice. That's when I realized something important. I was approaching grammar the wrong way. I had been treating grammar as something separate from speaking, something that I needed to study in isolation. But the truth was, grammar is not something to be memorized passively. It's something that should be learned organically through real usage and natural exposure to the language. One day, after another round of struggling with grammar exercises that didn't seem to stick, I decided to take a different approach. I thought back to how I had learned my native language, not by memorizing rules or doing exercises, but by hearing it spoken all around me and then starting to speak it myself. I decided that I would apply the same method to learning English. Grammar, by immersing myself in the language and using it in real contexts. The first step was to read more. I knew that reading wasn't just about building vocabulary. It was also an excellent way to understand how grammar works naturally. Every sentence I read was an example of grammar in action. I started reading books, articles, and blogs in English, paying close attention to how sentences were structured. I didn't focus on memorizing grammar rules from the texts. Instead, I tried to absorb how words were used together, how sentences flowed, and how grammar helped to communicate ideas clearly. One of the biggest breakthroughs came when I started reading authentic materials, such as novels, newspapers, and even social media posts in English. These weren't just books designed for learners. They were real examples of how native speakers use the language. I started noticing patterns in how grammar worked. For example, I would see how past tense verbs were used to talk about events that happened, or how prepositions like on, at, and in were used to describe locations and times. These weren't just theoretical examples. They were real-life sentences that helped me understand how English works. As I read, I didn't obsess over every detail. I didn't stop every time I encountered a new grammar structure. Instead, I allowed myself to take it all in without feeling overwhelmed. I trusted that by simply being exposed to the language in context, I would start internalizing these grammatical patterns. And little by little, I did. The more I read, the more I started to understand how sentences were constructed. My brain began to recognize the correct word order, verb tenses, and grammar rules without me having to actively memorize them. Another powerful way I reinforced grammar was through listening. I continued listening to podcasts, radio shows, TED Talks, and everyday conversations. Every time I listened to someone speak, I paid attention not only to the vocabulary they used, but also to the grammar structures they applied. I noticed how certain phrases were used in context, and how speakers combined different tenses or modals to express ideas. By listening to these real-life conversations, I started understanding grammar not as a set of rules, but as a tool for clear and effective communication. One of my favorite listening exercises involved watching TV shows and movies with English subtitles. I would pick a scene, watch it without subtitles first, and try to understand the conversation. Then I would watch it again, this time with subtitles, to check how accurate my understanding was. What I found most helpful was how the grammar was used naturally in the dialogue. For example, I would see how contractions like I'm and there were used in casual speech, or how the present perfect tense was applied to describe actions that were relevant to the present. These weren't textbook examples. They were authentic examples of grammar in use. As I continued to immerse myself in reading and listening, I realized something profound. Grammar didn't need to be a separate, isolated task. Instead of studying grammar as a dry academic subject, I began to see it as a living, breathing part of the language that came to life when used in context. By exposing myself to English in everyday situations, I started understanding grammar as something practical, something that was simply a tool to help me communicate more effectively. But even though reading and listening helped me understand grammar in context, I knew that I had to actively practice speaking to truly internalize the structures I was learning. The best way to do this was to speak as much as possible, using the grammar I had absorbed through reading and listening. I started speaking with my friends, classmates, and colleagues in London. I wasn't focused on speaking perfectly. Instead, I was focused on using the grammar structures I had learned, even if I made mistakes. The important thing was to keep trying, to keep using the language in real conversations. During this time, I also received valuable feedback from my teachers and peers. In class, I would use new grammar structures in my spoken responses, and my teacher would gently correct me when necessary. The more I practiced, the more I noticed improvements in my fluency and accuracy. I stopped thinking about grammar as a set of rules that I had to follow, and started thinking about it as a tool that helped me express myself clearly and naturally. One of the most useful techniques I used to reinforce my grammar was thinking aloud. This technique, which I had learned earlier in my journey, was incredibly powerful for practicing grammar. Whenever I had a thought, I would try to say it in English, even if it wasn't perfect. I would use the grammar structures I was trying to learn and pay attention to how I formed my sentences. This process helped me internalize the grammar naturally, as I wasn't just studying it in isolation. I was using it in real-life situations, as part of an ongoing conversation with myself and others. As I began to use grammar in this more natural way, I noticed that I stopped overthinking it. I didn't need to stop and analyze every sentence I said. The grammar simply came to me, just like it had when I first learned my native language. I was speaking more confidently without constantly second-guessing myself. The more I used the grammar in real conversations, the more fluent I became. Grammar had become a part of my English, not a barrier I had to overcome. One of the most important lessons I learned in this chapter of my journey was that grammar doesn't need to be feared. It's not something that should be isolated from the rest of the language. Grammar is the skeleton of communication, but the flesh of communication is in the context, the real conversations, the stories, the experiences. By exposing myself to English in authentic situations, I had learned grammar not as a set of rules to memorize, but as a tool that helped me express myself clearly and fluently. In the end, learning grammar the natural way was the key to unlocking my true potential as an English speaker. It wasn't about memorizing endless lists of rules. It was about practicing, listening, reading, and speaking in ways that made the grammar feel like a natural part of the language. And that, I realized, was the most effective way to truly learn. Chapter 9: Testing Her Progress. After months of hard work, studying, practicing, and pushing myself to improve my English, I started to feel like I was making significant progress. I had grown more confident in speaking, my listening skills had improved, and I could read and understand more complex texts. But despite all the strides I had made, there was still something inside me that wanted to know. How far had I really come? Was I really as good as I thought I was? Or was there still a long way to go before I could call myself truly fluent? Had been so focused on learning, practicing, and improving every day that I hadn't taken much time to evaluate my progress. I knew I had improved, but I wasn't sure exactly where I stood. Was my vocabulary strong enough? Was my grammar accurate? Could I handle more complex conversations? What were my strengths? And where did I still need to improve? These questions had been lingering in my mind, and I realized that it was time to get some concrete feedback. So I decided to test my progress. The first thing I did was to assess my speaking. I had gotten more comfortable speaking English in everyday situations, but I hadn't really tested myself in a more structured environment, like in an interview or formal conversation. I knew that to gauge my progress, I had to push myself outside of my comfort zone. I signed up for a language exchange program where I would have the opportunity to have real conversations with native English speakers. It was a bit intimidating, but I knew it was the best way to see how much I had truly internalized. The day of the language exchange arrived, and I was both excited and nervous. I had prepared as much as I could, but I still wasn't sure how smoothly the conversation would go. When I logged onto the video call with my language exchange partner, a native English speaker from the US, I immediately felt a wave of nervousness. What if I stumbled over my words? What if I couldn't understand them or find the right way to express myself? I took a deep breath and reminded myself that this was an opportunity to push my limits. We began the conversation by introducing ourselves. The first few minutes were a bit awkward. I was focused on making sure I pronounced everything correctly and using the right grammar. But as the conversation continued, I started to relax. I realized that my language partner was patient and didn't mind when I made mistakes. I could feel myself becoming more confident as we discussed topics like travel, hobbies, and cultural differences. I was surprised at how much I could express myself. I wasn't just using basic phrases. I was able to explain my thoughts and opinions in more detail, and I could follow along with the conversation without feeling lost. I made some mistakes along the way, of course, but I was able to correct myself and continue without feeling embarrassed. By the end of the conversation, I felt relieved and proud of how far I had come. I could tell that my speaking had improved because I was able to engage in a fluent, natural conversation, even though it wasn't perfect. It wasn't just about knowing the words. It was about being able to express myself and connect with someone in English. I felt like I had passed the test, but I knew that this was just one part of the bigger picture. The next step in testing my progress was to assess my listening skills. While I had gotten much better at understanding spoken English, especially in more casual contexts, I still sometimes struggled with faster speech or with unfamiliar accents. I decided to test my listening abilities by watching English language TV shows and movies without subtitles, something I hadn't done in a while. I chose a few shows that had fast-paced dialogue, some with different British accents, and others with American or Australian accents. As I watched the first episode, I found that I understood much more than I had expected. Sure, there were still moments when I needed to rewind or replay a sentence, but overall, I could grasp the meaning without much difficulty. I noticed that I had become accustomed to the rhythm and speed of natural speech. I was even able to pick up on slang and idiomatic expressions that I hadn't fully understood before. There were still some phrases I missed, but the more I watched, the easier it became. By the end of the week, I had watched several episodes of different shows without relying on subtitles, and I was thrilled with how much I had improved. This was a significant milestone for me because it showed that my listening skills had reached a level where I could enjoy English language entertainment without needing extra help. Now, it was time to test my writing skills. I had been writing in English regularly, journaling, writing essays for class, and even composing emails and messages to friends. But I wanted to see how well I could write in a more structured and formal way. I decided to take a writing test, something that would allow me to assess both my grammar and my ability to organize ideas coherently. I sat down and wrote a 500-word essay on a topic I felt comfortable with: the importance of learning foreign languages. As I wrote, I focused on applying the grammar rules I had learned and making sure my ideas were clear and well supported. After completing the essay, I read through it carefully and made edits. To my surprise, the essay turned out better than I expected. While there were a few grammatical mistakes and areas where I could have improved my sentence structure, I realized that I was able to express my ideas in a clear and organized way. I didn't feel as uncertain about my writing as I had in the past, and that was a huge confidence booster. To get more feedback, I asked one of my teachers to review my essay. She pointed out a few minor errors in verb tense and suggested that I vary my sentence structure a bit more, but overall, she praised my work. It was reassuring to see how far I had come. I wasn't perfect, but I had definitely improved my writing skills. Lastly, I wanted to test my vocabulary. I knew that my vocabulary had expanded over time, but I wanted to get a clearer sense of where I stood. I decided to use an online vocabulary test, which asked me to choose synonyms, fill in the blanks, and identify words in context. After completing the test, I found that my vocabulary was much stronger than I had anticipated. There were still a few words I didn't know, but overall, I felt proud of the progress I had made. It was clear that my exposure to English, through reading, listening, speaking, and writing, had helped me internalize a wide range of words and expressions. At this point, I felt like I had truly tested my progress across all areas of English. The results weren't perfect. There were still areas where I needed to improve, like my grammar and writing style, but I could see just how far I had come. More importantly, I realized that the key to improvement wasn't about perfection. It was about consistency. The more I practiced, the more I learned, and the more I used English in real-life situations, the better I became. Reflecting on my journey, I realized that testing my progress wasn't just about checking off boxes on a list. It was about celebrating the milestones along the way, recognizing how much I had grown, and understanding that the journey of learning a language is continuous. There will always be room for improvement, but the important thing is to keep moving forward, testing my limits, and pushing myself to become a better version of myself every day. Chapter 10: Embracing Mistakes and Growth. By now, I had come a long way in my journey to learn English. I had worked hard to expand my vocabulary, improve my pronunciation, and learn grammar in a natural way. I had taken the time to test my progress and celebrate my achievements. But even as I reached new milestones, there was one crucial lesson I had to learn, one that I hadn't fully understood at the beginning of my journey, and that lesson was about mistakes. When I first started learning English, I was terrified of making mistakes. I thought that every error, whether it was in my speaking, writing, or even my listening, meant I was failing. I feared that people would judge me or think I wasn't capable of learning. I would hesitate before speaking, afraid that I wouldn't pronounce a word correctly or that my sentence structure would be off. Every time I made a mistake, I would feel embarrassed and discouraged. I thought mistakes were something to avoid at all costs, that they were signs of failure rather than opportunities for growth. But over time, as I gained more experience and confidence, I started to see things differently. I began to realize that mistakes are not the enemy. In fact, they are an essential part of the learning process. They are not something to be ashamed of, but rather something to embrace. Every mistake I made was a chance to learn, to adjust, and to grow. And it wasn't just about making mistakes in grammar or vocabulary. It was about accepting the imperfection of the journey and being okay with not having everything figured out right away. This shift in mindset didn't happen overnight. It took time and reflection. One of the turning points for me was during a particularly challenging conversation I had at work. I had been practicing my English at the cafe, and one afternoon, a customer came in and asked me a question about the menu. I had understood most of what they said, but they spoke a little faster than I was used to, and they used a word I didn't quite catch. I tried to respond, but I fumbled over my words and ended up mixing up my tenses. I felt my face flush with embarrassment, and I immediately worried that the customer would think I wasn't good at my job. But instead of retreating into self-doubt, something surprising happened. The customer smiled, said, "Don't worry, I understand," and even helped me out by rephrasing their question in simpler terms. It was a small moment, but it had a huge impact on me. For the first time, I didn't see my mistake as a failure. Instead, I saw it as a learning opportunity. I realized that no one expects you to be perfect, especially when you're learning a new language. People are generally understanding and willing to help, and mistakes are just part of the process. The key is to keep moving forward, to keep trying, and to not let mistakes hold you back. This experience was a turning point, and it helped me start embracing mistakes in a different way. I began to understand that perfection is not the goal. Instead, the goal is to communicate, to express yourself, and to keep improving. No one speaks perfectly all the time. Even native speakers make mistakes. The important thing is how you react to those mistakes and how you learn from them. Another powerful lesson came when I was practicing English with a language exchange partner. We had been speaking for a few weeks, and I had felt more confident each time we met. But one day, I struggled to find the right words during our conversation. I got stuck on a sentence and I knew I had used the wrong tense. I started apologizing, but my partner stopped me and said, "Don't worry about it. We're learning together, and I make mistakes too." That simple reminder changed my perspective. I realized that learning is a shared experience, and mistakes are part of the process for everyone, not just for beginners. We're all in this together, and it's okay to make mistakes along the way. As I continued to practice, I became more comfortable with the idea of making mistakes. I stopped seeing them as something to fear and started seeing them as stepping stones to success. Every time I made a mistake, I took a moment to reflect on it, figure out what went wrong, and adjust for next time. If I mispronounced a word, I would look it up and practice saying it again. If I used the wrong preposition in a sentence, I would correct myself and move on. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being persistent, about continuing to try and improve, and about being kind to myself in the process. This mindset shift also helped me in my writing. At first, I was hesitant to write long essays or stories in English because I was afraid of making mistakes. I would worry about grammar, punctuation, and sentence structure. But eventually, I realized that writing was another opportunity for me to practice and learn. I started writing more freely, without stressing too much about mistakes. I would write drafts, let my ideas flow, and then go back to check for errors. Sometimes I would catch mistakes, and sometimes I wouldn't, but I wasn't afraid to make them anymore. Writing became a tool for self-expression, a way to reflect on my thoughts, and a way to grow. The most important lesson I learned was that mistakes do not define you. They do not determine your ability to succeed or your worth as a language learner. What matters is how you respond to them. Do you let them discourage you, or do you use them as an opportunity to learn and grow? I chose to embrace mistakes, not as failures, but as part of the journey. Every time I made a mistake, I became a little better. I learned a little more. And over time, those mistakes became fewer and fewer as I gained more confidence and fluency. The process of embracing mistakes taught me something deeper, that growth comes through perseverance, not through perfection. Language learning is a lifelong journey, and there will always be challenges, setbacks, and yes, mistakes along the way. But that's what makes the journey worthwhile. The joy of learning, the thrill of improving, and the satisfaction of knowing that each mistake is just a small part of becoming better. Looking back at my journey, I realized that embracing mistakes was the key to my growth. Without them, I wouldn't have learned as much. Without them, I wouldn't have discovered my own resilience, my own capacity for improvement, and most importantly, I wouldn't have gained the confidence to keep moving forward, knowing that I could continue to grow and succeed, one step at a time. So, my message to anyone learning a language or pursuing any goal is this: don't fear mistakes. Embrace them. Learn from them. And most importantly, keep going. You are capable of more than you think, and your mistakes are just the stepping stones on the path to success. Great work today. Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Easy English Spark channel for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.